He mistook the poor florist for a thief and was shocked when she saved his life minutes later. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, what is the kindest thing a stranger has ever done for you? And at the end of the story, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Enjoy. Stop, thief! I said stop right there. The shout cut through the chaotic symphony of a rain-soaked New York evening, a jarring, accusatory roar over the blare of car horns and the hiss of tires on wet asphalt. Ava Wilson froze, her hand still clutching the handle of the briefcase that had just been knocked from her grasp. She spun around, a bouquet of delicate, rain-spattered baby's breath clutched in her other hand, and found herself facing a man who looked like a thundercloud in a $1,000 suit. "Thief?" she repeated, her voice a mix of disbelief and indignation. "Are you insane? I'm a florist." Edward Shaw didn't seem to hear her. He was late for his flight, his billion-dollar merger was on the line, and now this. The collision had been sudden, a clumsy bump in the hurried crowd. He dropped his briefcase, and in the split second of chaos, he saw her, a woman in a simple raincoat, scoop it up. His stressed-out mind jumped to the only logical conclusion. "Don't play dumb with me," he snarled, advancing on her. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes piercing and merciless. "I know your type. You create a distraction and then you run. Hand it over. Now." Eva's shock quickly hardened into anger. She held the briefcase out, her own eyes flashing with defiance. "My type? You have no idea who I am. I was picking it up for you, you lunatic." He snatched the briefcase from her, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was electric, but he was too consumed by his own righteous anger to notice. "I'm sure you were." He began to check the contents, his back slightly turned to the street. "You know what?" Ava said, her voice shaking with rage. "Forget it. Some people don't deserve kindness." She turned to leave, furious at being treated like a criminal. She took 2 steps and then stopped, a gut feeling making the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. A sound that was wrong. It was the high-pitched squeal of tires failing to grip the slick, rain-drenched pavement. Ava spun back around. Edward was still fumbling with the lock on his briefcase, completely oblivious, his attention fixated on his perceived problem. But the real problem was a yellow taxi, hydroplaning, its back end swinging out in a wild, uncontrolled arc, heading directly for the spot where he stood. There was no time to shout, no time to think. Acting on pure instinct, Ava lunged forward. "Look out!" she screamed, dropping her bouquet and throwing her entire body into his. The impact was a solid, desperate shove. Edward stumbled forward, completely caught off guard by the force of her push. He lost his footing on the slick sidewalk, his arms flailing. "What the?" he began to yell, just as he crashed to the ground. The world became a blur of sound and motion. The roar of the taxi's engine, the sickening sound of metal scraping against a fire hydrant just inches from where he had been standing, and the splash of dirty rainwater as the taxi fishtailed back onto the street and sped away into the night. Edward lay on the cold, wet concrete, the air knocked out of his lungs. His mind was a chaotic mess. One second he was accusing a thief, the next he was on the ground, his heart hammering against his ribs, the ghost of a speeding taxi echoing in his ears. He pushed himself up on his elbows, his expensive suit now soaked and scraped. "What just happened?" he gasped, turning to where Ava was already getting to her feet, her face pale but her eyes blazing with adrenaline. "You were about to become a very wealthy hood ornament," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You're welcome." The briefcase lay between them, its clasps broken from the fall. It had sprung open, its contents scattered across the wet sidewalk, but it wasn't full of corporate documents or stock reports. There were only 2 things inside, a worn, leather-bound journal and a single, perfect and now tragically crushed black flower. Edward's anger, his stress, his frustration, it all evaporated, replaced by a cold, sickening wave of horror. "No," he whispered, scrambling towards the scattered items. He ignored the journal and went straight for the flower. Its velvety black petals were torn, its delicate stem snapped, it was ruined. "A black bat orchid," Ava said softly, kneeling beside him. Her voice had lost its anger, now filled with a quiet, professional sadness as she looked at the destroyed bloom. "Taka chantrieri. It's incredibly rare, and incredibly fragile." Edward looked up at her, his face a mask of raw, unguarded pain. The arrogant CEO was gone, replaced by someone she didn't recognize. "How do you know that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I told you," she said, gently touching one of the ruined petals. "I'm a florist." He stared at the crushed flower in his hands, then at her. The woman he had called a thief. The woman who had just saved his life. The woman who knew the name of the one thing in the world he couldn't bear to lose. "It was my mother's favorite," he said, the confession ripped from him, raw and painful. "She passed away last month. This was from her private collection. It was the last one." The weight of his words hung in the rain-filled air. Suddenly Ava understood. This wasn't about a briefcase. It was about a memory, a final connection to someone he had lost. The arrogance, the anger, it had all been a mask for his grief. "I'm so sorry," she said, and this time the words were filled with a genuine empathy that cut through the noise of the city. Edward looked from the ruined flower to her face, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the kindness in her eyes, the strength in her jaw, the way she looked at the flower, not as a plant, but as something that had meant something. She understood. "Find me another one," he said, the words a desperate plea, not a command. "I need you to find another one. I'll pay you whatever it takes." Ava looked at him, at the billionaire who now looked like a lost little boy. Her anger had vanished, replaced by a confusing mix of pity and a strange, powerful connection. Her dream was to open her own flower shop, a dream that felt impossibly far away. And now this man, this impossible, arrogant, and heartbroken man, was offering her a chance. But it came at a cost she wasn't sure she was willing to pay. "I don't know if I can," she said honestly. "They're not something you can just buy." "Please," he said, and the word was so stripped of its usual power, so full of raw need, that it struck her to her core. "You have to try." The chaotic energy of the street corner eventually receded, replaced by the sterile quiet of a luxury sedan. Edward had insisted on driving Ava home, a demand she was too soaked and shaken to refuse. The car smelled of leather and rain, a strange combination that perfectly mirrored the tension inside. "I'll need your contact information," he said, his voice flat as he navigated the slick streets. The arrogant CEO was back in control, or at least trying to be. Ava stared out the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of color. "Why? So you can send me a bill for your therapy after I almost got you killed?" He glanced at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "No, so I can be updated on your search." "My search hasn't officially begun," she retorted, pulling her damp raincoat tighter. "And for the record, I saved your life. That usually earns more than a job offer made under duress." He didn't respond to that. Instead, he handed her a sleek, impossibly thin phone. "This is a direct line to me. Keep it. I've already transferred an initial retainer to the account I had my assistant set up for you. Consider it a down payment on your expertise." Ava looked at the phone as if it were a foreign object. An account? A retainer? He was moving at a speed she couldn't comprehend. "You don't even know if I can find it." "You're the only lead I have," he said, pulling up in front of her modest apartment building. The contrast between his gleaming car and her crumbling brick walk-up was stark. She took the phone but didn't get out of the car immediately. "Mr. Shaw," she said, her voice serious, "if I do this, we do it my way. This world, the world of rare orchids, it doesn't operate on your schedule. It requires patience." "I'm not a patient man, Miss Wilson." "Then you'll have to learn," she said, and for the first time that night, she gave him a small, genuine smile. "Or you can try finding a black bat orchid on Amazon. Good luck with that." She got out of the car and disappeared into her building, leaving Edward alone with the quiet hum of the engine. He watched her go, a strange mix of frustration and fascination churning inside him. She was right. He had no choice but to play the game by her rules. The next morning, Ava walked into her flower shop, the gilded petal, and felt the familiar sense of peace settle over her. It was her sanctuary. The small, charmingly cluttered space was an explosion of life. The earthy scent of damp soil, the sweet perfume of lilies, the vibrant chaos of ferns and fiddle-leaf figs spilling from their pots. It wasn't just a shop, it was an extension of her soul. And it was on the verge of bankruptcy. She looked at the past-due notice for the rent, tucked discreetly behind a pot of lavender. The shop was her dream, a legacy from her parents, but dreams didn't pay the bills. The initial retainer from Edward Shaw, a number with more zeros than she was used to seeing, was a lifeline she desperately needed. But it felt like a deal with the devil. "Okay, Mom and Dad," she whispered to an old, framed photo on the counter showing a smiling couple covered in dirt. "Looks like we're going on an orchid hunt." She spent the morning making calls, tapping into her network of suppliers, botanists, and fellow plant enthusiasts. The response was always the same, a low whistle, followed by a doubtful, "A black bat orchid? Good luck, Ava. You'll need it." She was sketching in her notebook, trying to map out a potential list of private collectors, when the bell above the door chimed. Ava looked up, expecting her usual mid-morning customer, an elderly woman who bought a single daisy every day. Instead, Edward Shaw stood in the doorway, looking as out of place as a skyscraper in a garden. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his polished shoes a stark contrast to the dirt-smudged floor. He looked around the shop, his expression a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled disdain. "This is it?" he asked, his eyes landing on a slightly crooked shelf overflowing with ivy. "This is it," Ava confirmed, closing her notebook and standing up, her professional demeanor clicking into place. "Welcome to the Gilded Petal. Try not to break anything expensive. Oh wait," she added with a sarcastic smile, "everything in here is more valuable than money." He ignored the jibe, walking deeper into the shop, his movements stiff and cautious as if he were navigating a minefield. "Have you found it yet?" Ava couldn't help but laugh. "Mr. Shaw, it's been less than 24 hours. Finding a conceptuary isn't like ordering a pizza. They don't just appear because a rich man snaps his fingers." "I'm not just any rich man," he said, his tone sharp with impatience. "And I expect results. And I," she countered, stepping out from behind the counter, "expect you to understand that this is my world, and in my world, things grow at their own pace." She walked over to a table where she was nursing a delicate orchid. "This one," she said, gently touching a petal, "took 5 years to bloom. Some things are worth the wait." He was silent for a moment, watching her. The way she touched the flower was with a tenderness and reverence he had never seen before. "My mother used to say that," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Ava looked at him, surprised by the sudden vulnerability. "She had good taste." "She had patience," he corrected, his gaze distant, "something I never inherited." He walked over to her work table, his eyes landing on the open page of her sketchbook. On it was a detailed, beautifully rendered drawing of a flower she was designing in her mind, a hybrid, something that didn't exist yet. "What's this?" he asked, pointing to the drawing. "Just an idea," she said, a little self-conscious. "A dream. I like to imagine new species. A rose that smells like rain, a lily that changes color with the moonlight." He looked at the drawing, then back at her, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. He wasn't just dealing with a florist, he was dealing with an artist, a dreamer. For the first time, he saw her not as a means to an end, but as a person with her own complex, beautiful world. It was the first, and most important, small big gesture, the simple act of seeing. "It's beautiful," he said, and the compliment was so genuine, so stripped of his usual arrogance, that it caught her off guard. "Thank you," she murmured, feeling her cheeks grow warm. He cleared his throat, the moment of connection making him uncomfortable. He pulled himself back to business. "So what's the plan? You said this requires patience. How much patience exactly?" Ava took a deep breath, shifting back into her role as the expert. "The plan is to contact private collectors. There are a few in the tri-state area who are known for their exotic collections. It will require discretion, diplomacy, and access." "I can provide the access," he said immediately. "I'm sure you can," she replied with a wry smile. "But the diplomacy is my department. These people don't respond to money, Mr. Shaw. They respond to respect, respect for the plants, and respect for the passion." "Then you'll have a budget for whatever you need," he said, pulling out a black credit card and placing it on the counter. "No limit. Just find the flower." Ava looked at the card, a piece of plastic that represented more money than she had ever seen. It was a lifeline for her shop, a ticket to her dream. But it was also a chain. "I'll need more than a credit card," she said, pushing it back towards him. "I'll need you to trust me. This search might take us to some strange places. You'll have to be prepared to get your hands dirty." He looked at his own manicured hands, then back at her. A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "Fine, Miss Wilson," he said, picking up the card and putting it back in his wallet. "Lead the way. Just try not to get me killed. Again." She laughed, a real genuine laugh that seemed to fill the small shop with light. "No promises, Mr. Shaw," she said, the challenge sparkling in her eyes. "No promises at all." For 2 days, a tense silence hung between Edward's world and Ava's. He didn't call. She didn't call. He was a man accustomed to his orders being followed, and he expected her to report in like any other contractor. She, on the other hand, was a woman who understood that some delicate things, like finding a nearly mythical flower, couldn't be rushed by a billionaire's timetable. Ava spent those 2 days deep in research. She didn't just look for suppliers. She looked for stories. She dug through old botanical journals, obscure online forums for orchid enthusiasts, and auction house archives. She was hunting for a ghost, and ghosts don't advertise in the yellow pages. Finally, on the 3rd morning, she found a name. Silas Blackwood, a reclusive collector who lived in a remote corner of the Hudson Valley. He was a legend in the botanical world, known for his sprawling, private greenhouse filled with some of the rarest plants on the planet. He was also known for being incredibly eccentric and for despising the corporate world. Ava picked up the burner phone Edward had given her and dialed his number. "I have a lead," she said without any preamble when he answered. "It's about time," he replied, his voice clipped with impatience. "Where is it? I'll have it picked up." Ava couldn't help but smile at his arrogance. "That's not how this works, Mr. Shaw. This isn't a package waiting at a post office. It's a man who probably uses $100 bills as fertilizer. We have to go to him." There was a pause on the other end. "We?" "Yes, we. You're the one who wants the flower. And Silas Blackwood, our target, doesn't talk to just anyone. He needs to see the passion, the desperation," she added, a hint of sarcasm in her voice. "You'll be the desperate one. I'll be the passion." He let out a frustrated sigh. "Fine, I'll have my driver pick you up in an hour. We'll take the helicopter." "No," she said firmly. "No helicopters, no limousines, no parade of black cars. This man lives off the grid because he hates people like you. We need to look humble." "Humble?" He repeated the word as if it were a foreign language. "Yes, humble. I'll drive. I have a car. Pick me up at my shop in 2 hours, and for God's sake, don't wear a suit." She hung up before he could argue, leaving Edward staring at his phone in disbelief. A florist was giving him orders. And the most infuriating part, she was right. 2 hours later, Edward stood in front of the gilded petal, feeling profoundly out of place. He was wearing dark jeans and a simple cashmere sweater that still probably cost more than Ava's monthly rent, but it was the closest he could get to humble. Ava's car, a battered but well-loved Subaru station wagon that smelled faintly of soil and rain, pulled up to the curb. She leaned over and pushed open the passenger door. "Get in," she said with a grin. "The chariot awaits." He got in, the car's interior a chaotic but charming mess of gardening tools, stray leaves, and empty coffee cups. It was the antithesis of his own sterile, perfectly organized world. "Are you sure this thing will make it to the Hudson Valley?" he asked, eyeing a crack in the windshield. "She's got more character than your entire fleet of German sedans," Ava retorted, pulling out into traffic. "Her name is Petunia, and she's very sensitive, so be nice." The 2-hour drive was an exercise in forced proximity. The radio played a mix of indie folk music that made Edward's teeth ache. He was used to the silence of his chauffeured car or the drone of financial news. "So," he said, desperate to break the musical torture, "this Silas Blackwood. What's his story?" "He was a biotech prodigy in the 80s, Ava explained, her eyes on the road. "Made a fortune, then vanished. Poured all his money into creating one of the world's most impressive private greenhouses. They say he talks to his plants more than he talks to people." "Wonderful," Edward muttered. "We're going to visit a crazy plant whisperer." "He's not crazy," Ava corrected. "He's passionate. There's a difference. He believes plants have a soul, that they remember." "Remember what? The last time they were watered?" "They remember the hands that care for them," she said, her voice soft. She glanced at him. "My mother used to say the same thing. She could make anything grow." He was silent for a moment, the mention of her mother creating a small, unexpected bridge between them. "So could mine," he admitted quietly. The rest of the drive passed in a more comfortable silence. They stopped once at a roadside diner for coffee. Edward, who was used to artisanal espresso, stared at the watery brown liquid in his styrofoam cup with horror. "It builds character," Ava said, sipping hers with relish. "It tastes like disappointment," he grumbled, but he drank it anyway. Silas Blackwood's property was hidden at the end of a long, unpaved road. There was no grand gate, just a simple wooden sign that read, "Trespassers will be composted." They were greeted at the door of a rustic farmhouse by Silas himself. He was a man in his 70s, with a wild mane of white hair, a long beard, and eyes as sharp and intelligent as a hawk's. He was wearing overalls and holding a pair of gardening shears. "You're the florist," he said, his gaze skipping right over Edward and landing on Ava. "I received your email, and you," he added, finally acknowledging Edward with a dismissive glance, "must be the money." "I'm Edward Shaw," Edward said, extending a hand. Silas ignored it. "I don't care who you are. I care about what you want. You want the bat orchid. Why?" "It's for a personal matter," Edward said, his tone clipped. "Personal matter is what people say when they want to impress a woman or decorate a soulless penthouse," Silas retorted. "The taka is not a decoration. She is a queen. She demands respect." He turned his back on Edward and looked at Ava. Why do you want it?" Ava took a step forward, her demeanor respectful but not subservient. "Because the orchid is a memory. It represents a connection to someone who is gone, and that connection was broken. We're trying to restore it." Silas studied her for a long moment, his hawk-like eyes searching hers. "You understand," he said finally, a grudging respect in his voice. "You understand that a flower can be more than just a flower." He turned, gesturing for them to follow. "Come. I will show you." He led them not to the main house, but to a massive sprawling glass structure behind it, the legendary greenhouse. The moment they stepped inside, Edward felt like he had entered another world. The air was warm and humid, thick with the scent of damp earth and 1,000 different blossoms. It was a cathedral of green, with plants of every shape and size reaching towards the glass ceiling. "My God," Edward whispered, stunned by the sheer beauty and scale of it all. "This isn't a collection," Silas said, his voice filled with pride as he walked them down a narrow path. "This is a sanctuary." He stopped in front of a section dedicated to orchids, a dazzling display of color and form. "The taka is a difficult one," he said, more to Ava than to Edward. "She is moody. She requires darkness, humidity, and a specific kind of neglect. You cannot force her to bloom." "Like some people," Ava said quietly, and she and Edward exchanged a quick, meaningful glance. "I had one," Silas admitted, his expression turning somber. "A magnificent specimen, but she died last winter. The heating system failed for one night. It was enough." Edward's heart sank. "A dead end." "So you don't have one?" "No," Silas said. He looked at Ava, a flicker of something, perhaps a test, in his eyes. But a true botanist, a true lover of the art, would know that possessing the flower is not the only goal. The search itself is what matters. He looked Ava up and down. "You say you're a florist, but you look like a girl playing dress-up. What do you truly know of passion?" Before Ava could respond, Edward stepped forward. "She knows more than you think," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The sudden defense surprised even himself. He looked at Silas. "My mother, she had a greenhouse? Not like this one," he said with a small, self-deprecating smile. "But it was her sanctuary. She had a collection of orchids. She used to say that each one had a personality. Some were divas, some were shy. She knew all of them." He paused, a memory flickering in his eyes. "She told me that the black bat orchid was her favorite because it didn't pretend. It was dark and strange and beautiful in its own way. It was honest." He finally looked at Ava. "When I see the way Ms. Wilson looks at a flower, the way she talks about them, I see the same passion, the same respect." The greenhouse was silent, save for the gentle drip of water somewhere in the lush foliage. Ava stared at Edward, completely floored. He had just shared a deeply personal memory. He had defended her, not with his power or his money, but with his heart. He had validated her in front of this difficult, judgmental man. Silas looked from Edward to Ava, his stern expression softening. He saw the sincerity in Edward's eyes, and the shocked gratitude in hers. "You loved your mother very much," Silas said to Edward. It wasn't a question. Edward just nodded, unable to speak. Silas turned to Ava. "He's right. You do have the passion. I see it in your eyes. He let out a long sigh. I do not have the flower you seek. But, he said, a new spark in his eyes, I may know where one can be found. He walked over to a cluttered desk and picked up an old, leather-bound book. There was a botanist, a contemporary of my father's, who was obsessed with the taka. He disappeared into the Amazon decades ago, but he left his research behind. It's all in a private archive at the New York Botanical Library. He handed the book to Ava. If a living specimen exists in this part of the world, the clue to finding it will be in there. But the archive is sealed. Access is difficult. We'll get access, Edward said, his voice regaining some of its old command, but his eyes, when they met Ava's, were different. They were partners now. On the drive back to the city, the atmosphere in the car was changed. The silence was no longer tense but comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. Petunia the Subaru chugged along, and for the first time, Edward didn't seem to mind the indie folk music. Thank you, Ava said softly, breaking the silence. For what? For what you said in there. About my passion, about your mother. He just nodded, his eyes on the road. It was the truth. She smiled to herself, looking out the window as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the rolling hills. They hadn't found the orchid, but they had found something else, something far more rare and fragile, and it was just beginning to bloom. Edward Shaw was not used to waiting. He built his empire on speed, efficiency, and the unwavering belief that any problem could be solved with enough money and pressure. The New York Botanical Library's sealed archive was about to learn that lesson. The morning after their trip to the Hudson Valley, he was on the phone, his voice a low, commanding hum. I don't care what your protocol is, he said to the library's director. I need access to the Alastair Finch collection. Today. Yes, Finch, the botanist. Consider it a matter of extreme cultural preservation. And yes, a substantial donation to the library's preservation fund will be made by the end of the day. He hung up and looked at Ava, who was sitting across from him in his sterile, minimalist office. She was nursing a cup of coffee, looking completely unfazed by his display of corporate power. You know, she said, taking a sip, you could have just asked nicely. Asking nicely takes too long, he retorted, already putting on his jacket. We have an appointment in 1 hour. Be ready. Ava just shook her head with a smile. The man was a bulldozer in a bespoke suit. The archive was nothing like Silas Blackwood's vibrant greenhouse. It was a silent, temperature-controlled vault in the library's basement, smelling of old paper and dust. A severe-looking archivist with glasses perched on her nose led them to a large table. The Alastair Finch collection, she said, her voice a dry whisper as several large, dusty boxes were wheeled out. No food, no drinks. And please, handle the materials with care. Some of these journals are over a century old. Edward looked at the mountain of boxes, his impatience already starting to fray. How are we supposed to find one clue in all of this? With patience, Ava said, a familiar sparkle in her eye. She opened the first box with a reverence that was almost religious, carefully lifting out a leather-bound journal. This is a treasure hunt, Mr. Shaw. Try to enjoy it. For the first hour, he did not enjoy it. He sat stiffly in his chair, awkwardly turning the fragile pages of a ledger filled with shipping manifests from the 1890s. The silence of the room was absolute, broken only by the soft rustle of paper. He felt useless. Ava, on the other hand, was in her element. Her eyes scanned the pages with a focused intensity, her fingers tracing the faded ink as if she were reading a sacred text. This is incredible, she murmured, completely absorbed. He was tracking migration patterns of moths to predict orchid pollination cycles. He was decades ahead of his time. Edward just grunted, his mind already drifting to the quarterly reports he was ignoring. He felt a familiar restlessness, the urge to check his phone, to make a call, to do something. He was a man of action, and this slow, meticulous work was a form of torture. I'm going to get some air, he said, standing up abruptly. Ava didn't even look up. Okay, she said, already lost in another journal. He walked out of the archive and paced the hallway, feeling like a caged tiger. He had solved $100 million problems in less time than it was taking to get through one dusty box. But he had made a promise. He had told her he would trust her. He took a deep breath, walked to the library cafe, and did something he hadn't done in years. He stood in line. He ordered 2 coffees and 2 simple turkey sandwiches on rye. He remembered her mentioning she liked them during their drive. It was a ridiculously normal act, but for him it felt revolutionary. When he returned to the archive, he placed the coffee and sandwich next to her. "Lunch break," he said simply. She looked up, startled out of her historical trance. She hadn't even realized it was afternoon. She saw the simple sandwich and the coffee, and a slow, surprised smile spread across her face. He had remembered. It was a small thing, a ridiculous thing, but it was a detail about her that he had retained. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was so genuinely warm that it made his stomach do a strange little flip. They ate in a comfortable silence, a truce between his world of speed and hers of patience. The simple act of sharing a meal in that quiet, dusty room felt more intimate than any of the fancy business dinners he had ever attended. After they ate, Ava's energy was renewed. She dived back into the journals, her excitement infectious. "Listen to this," she said, her finger tracing a line of elegant looping script. It was from Finch's personal diary. "October 12th, 1898. I have failed again. The Taka eludes me. She is a creature of shadow and myth, a dark queen who refuses to be courted by science. Maria says, I am obsessed. She says I love this phantom flower more than I love her. Perhaps she is right, but this obsession, it is its own kind of love. Is it not? A love for the impossible." Edward was silent for a moment. The words resonated with him in a way he didn't expect. His own desperate, all-consuming search, his mother's quiet obsession with her greenhouse. It was all there, in the words of a man who had lived 100 years ago. "He sounds like a man who was haunted," Edward said quietly. "Or a man who was deeply in love," Ava countered, looking at him. "With the flower and with Maria." They kept reading, the afternoon fading into a dim evening outside the library's high windows. The archivist had long since given up on hovering over them, content to let them work in peace. As the room grew colder, Ava shivered, rubbing her arms. She was so engrossed in a particularly dense botanical text that she didn't notice Edward stand up, take off his expensive cashmere sweater, and gently drape it over her shoulders. The warmth and the faint, clean scent of his cologne enveloped her. She stopped reading and looked up at him. He was standing over her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You are cold," was all he said. She didn't say thank you this time. She just looked at him, and in that long, silent gaze, a new level of understanding passed between them. It was a gesture of pure, simple care, and it touched her more deeply than any grand, expensive act ever could. She pulled the sweater tighter around her and went back to the book. But now she was intensely aware of him, of his presence in the quiet room, of the steady rhythm of his breathing. It was close to 10 p.m. when she found it. "Edward," she whispered, her voice electric with excitement. He was dozing lightly in his chair and jerked awake. "What is it? Did you find it?" "Better," she said, her finger pointing to a page in the back of Finch's personal journal. It was a hand-drawn map, but it wasn't a map of a place. It was a complex diagram of a plant's root system, and hidden within the intricate lines of the drawing were a series of letters and numbers. "It's a cipher," Edward said, his mind instantly snapping into analytical mode. He was back in his element. For the next hour they worked together, heads bent close over the ancient journal. He, with his logical, pattern-recognizing mind, and she, with her intuitive understanding of the botanist's way of thinking. The numbers correspond to page numbers in his other journals, she realized, and the letters are the first letter of the first word on that page. They worked frantically, pulling journals, flipping pages, scribbling down letters. Slowly, a message began to form. "My queen rests where whispers live in glass. Seek the keeper of secrets. Julian Croft." "Julian Croft," Edward repeated, typing the name into his phone. A few seconds later, an article popped up. "Julian Croft, renowned architect and designer of experimental greenhouses, died in 1972. His final and most mysterious project was a private commission known only as the Glass House of Whispers." Ava and Edward looked at each other, a triumphant, shared grin spreading across their faces. They had done it. They had found the next step. The adrenaline of the discovery slowly faded, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. They had been in the archive for over 12 hours. Books and papers were scattered all over the table and the floor around them. Ava leaned her head back against the wall, closing her eyes. "I think my brain is made of dust," she murmured. Edward chuckled, a low, tired sound. He looked at her, at the way the dim light softened the lines of her face, at the way his sweater was still wrapped around her. She looked beautiful, and real, and so incredibly alive in that silent room of ghosts. He watched as her breathing deepened, her head slumping slightly to the side as she finally drifted off to sleep, right there on the floor, surrounded by a century of secrets. He should have woken her. He should have called his driver to take them home. Instead, he just sat in his chair, watching over her. He felt a powerful, unfamiliar wave of protectiveness wash over him. In his world, people were assets, contracts, and competitors. But this woman, this stubborn, brilliant, passionate florist, she was something else entirely. He closed his own eyes, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up to him. He didn't mean to sleep, but in the quiet of the archive, with the scent of old paper and the steady rhythm of Ava's breathing filling the air, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. And so, surrounded by the ghosts of an old obsession, a new one was quietly taking root. Ava woke to the unfamiliar scent of old paper and the distinct feeling that her neck was permanently fixed at a 90-degree angle. She slowly opened her eyes, the dim light of the library's basement filtering through the dusty air. For a moment, she was completely disoriented. Then it all came back. The journals, the cipher, the map, and Edward. Her gaze shifted to the figure slumped in the armchair across from her. Edward Shaw, the billionaire titan of industry, was asleep with his head lolled back, his mouth slightly open, and a thin line of drool tracing a path down his chin. His $1,000 sweater, the one he had draped over her shoulders, was now rumpled and covered in what looked like a fine layer of 19th-century dust. A laugh escaped her, a soft, genuine sound that echoed in the silence. The sight was so utterly, profoundly human that it shattered the last of her intimidation. Her laugh stirred him. He jerked awake, blinking in confusion. "What? Where are we?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Good morning, Sleeping Beauty," she said, her voice laced with amusement as she stretched, wincing at the series of cracks that came from her spine. "Welcome to day 2 of our historical adventure," he groaned, rubbing his neck. "I feel like I slept on a pile of rocks." "Close," she said, gesturing to the floor. "A pile of 19th-century botanical journals." He looked at her, at his sweater still wrapped around her shoulders, at the intimate, disheveled scene they had created, and a deep flush crept up his neck. This was a new territory for him. He wasn't in his boardroom or his penthouse. He was on the floor of a library basement with a woman who had seen him drool. "We should go," he said, getting to his feet with the stiffness of a man twice his age. "Not before coffee," she declared, standing up and handing him back his sweater. "A real one this time. My treat. You look like you need it." He watched her as she gathered her things, a strange warmth spreading through his chest. He had slept on the floor of a dusty archive and felt more rested than he had in his own multi-million-dollar bed in years. By the time they emerged from the library into the bright morning light, Edward was already on his phone, his CEO persona clicking back into place. "I need a location," he barked into the phone. "A private property known as the Glass House of Whispers. Architect Julian Croft. Yes, I'll hold." He paced the sidewalk, a lion returned to his natural habitat of command and control. Ava watched him, a small smile on her face. The contrast between the man on the phone and the man who had slept with his mouth open was jarring, and she found she liked both versions more than she was willing to admit. "Got it," he said, hanging up. "It's in upstate New York, a remote estate that's been tied up in probate for years." His phone buzzed again. He glanced at it, his expression hardening. "That was my pilot. The jet is ready for the trip to Berlin. The board meeting is tomorrow." Ava's heart sank a little. Of course, his real life was calling. This strange, magical treasure hunt was just a temporary detour for him. "You should go," she said, trying to keep the disappointment out of her voice. "You can get your people to handle this." Edward looked from his phone to her. He saw the flicker of disappointment in her eyes, no matter how hard she tried to hide it. He thought of the meeting in Berlin, a deal worth hundreds of millions. He thought of his board, his responsibilities, the empire he had built. Then he thought of the quiet archive, of the shared sandwich, of the sweater on her shoulders, of the way her face had lit up when she deciphered the code. He thought of his mother's flower. He brought the phone to his ear. "Klaus," he said, his voice firm and decisive. "Cancel the trip to Berlin. Postpone the meeting. Something more important has come up." He hung up before his pilot could protest and looked at Ava, whose eyes were now wide with surprise. "Something more important?" she repeated, her voice a near whisper. "Much more important," he confirmed, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Now, I believe you offered to drive. Petunia can handle another road trip, can't she?" She stared at him, a whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. He had chosen this. He had chosen her. Over a multi-million-dollar deal. It was the biggest and most significant small-big gesture yet. "Yeah," she said, a brilliant, dazzling smile breaking across her face. Petunia would be honored. The glass house of whispers was not what they expected. It was hidden deep within a forgotten estate. A magnificent cathedral of glass and rusted iron, half swallowed by overgrown ivy and wild roses. Sunlight streamed through the grimy panes, illuminating a scene of breathtaking, chaotic beauty. It was a lost world, filled with exotic, untamed plants that had grown wild for decades, their leaves pressing against the glass, their roots cracking the marble floors. "My God," Ava whispered, stepping inside. It smelled of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sweet perfume of 1,000 forgotten blooms. "It's a masterpiece." "It's a ruin," Edward countered, but even he couldn't deny the strange, haunting beauty of the place. They walked through the overgrown paths, their footsteps echoing in the vast, silent space. It was like a fairy tale, a sleeping palace of flora. They found strange, beautiful flowers they had never seen before, orchids of impossible colors, and vines that had woven themselves into intricate tapestries. "Finch's ghost is here," Ava said, her voice filled with awe. "I can feel it." They were so captivated by the magical ruin that they didn't hear the sound of an approaching car until a crisp, authoritative voice cut through the silence. "Can I help you?" They turned to see a woman standing at the entrance. She was in her late 30s, dressed in a sharp, tailored pantsuit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She was holding a tablet and looking at them not with curiosity, but with the cold, assessing gaze of a real estate developer. "We're here to see the Julian Croft collection," Edward said, stepping forward, his CEO persona taking over. "There is no collection," the woman said, her tone clipped. "Just an overgrown greenhouse, and this is private property." "I'm Edward Shaw," he said, expecting his name to have its usual effect. The woman didn't even blink. "I know who you are. I'm Eleanor Croft. Julian was my grandfather." She tapped on her tablet. "And you are trespassing." "We were given a lead," Ava interjected gently. "We're looking for a very rare orchid, a Taka chantrieri." Eleanor let out a short, humorless laugh. "An orchid? My grandfather was obsessed with plants. I'm obsessed with property values. We have very different priorities." "We're prepared to make a significant offer for the flower," Edward said, pulling out his checkbook. "Name your price." Eleanor looked at the checkbook, then back at him, a flicker of amusement in her cold eyes. "Mr. Shaw, you seem to think everything has a price. It's a charmingly simplistic worldview." She gestured around the decaying greenhouse. "This land, however, already has a price. A much, much bigger one." "What do you mean?" Ava asked, a knot of dread forming in her stomach. "I mean I just finalized the sale of this entire estate to a consortium of luxury resort developers," Eleanor said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "They're breaking ground in 2 weeks." Ava gasped. "Breaking ground? But what about all this?" She gestured to the breathtaking jungle around them. "This?" Eleanor said with a dismissive wave. "This is a teardown. The demolition crew is scheduled to start at the end of next week." "Demolish it?" Ava's voice was filled with horror. "You can't. This place is a living museum. It's your grandfather's legacy. My grandfather's legacy was a pile of debt and a property I've been trying to unload for 10 years, Eleanor retorted coldly. "His passion didn't pay the bills. This sale does." She looked at Edward, a final dismissive glance. "So you can put your checkbook away, Mr. Shaw. You're too late." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking on the cracked marble, her voice already barking orders into her phone about zoning permits and excavation crews. Ava and Edward were left standing in the silent, sun-dappled ruin, the death sentence of the glass house of whispers hanging in the air between them. They had found their sanctuary, and they had found it just in time to watch it be destroyed. "We have to do something," Ava whispered, her voice fierce with a protective passion. Edward looked at the magnificent, doomed structure, then at the determined, heartbroken woman standing beside him. He thought of his own world, a world where old buildings were torn down for new, taller ones, a world where profit was the only legacy that mattered. He had been a king in that world. But looking at Ava, he knew with a certainty that shook him to his core that he didn't want to be that king anymore. "I know," he said, his voice quiet but firm as he took her hand. "And we will." The drive back from the glass house of whispers was a silent storm. Ava stared out the window of Petunia the Subaru, her mind replaying Eleanor Croft's cold, dismissive words. A tear down. The phrase echoed in her head, a death sentence for a place she had only just discovered, but already felt a fierce need to protect. Edward drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. The relaxed, almost carefree man who had enjoyed the roadside coffee was gone. In his place was the CEO, the predator, the man whose entire life was built on winning. And he had just been told he was too late. "She's not going to get away with this," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that broke the heavy silence. "What can we do?" Ava asked, her own voice a mix of despair and defiance. "She said the deal is done. The developers can be bought." He cut her off, his mind already calculating angles, leverage points, and financial weaknesses. "Everyone has a price. I'll find theirs." It was the old Edward speaking, the man who believed any obstacle could be flattened with enough money. Ava wanted to tell him it wasn't that simple, that a place like the glass house couldn't be saved with the same tools that were trying to destroy it, but she held her tongue. He was hurting. This was his way of fighting back. The moment they arrived back at his penthouse, he was on the phone, his voice a staccato burst of commands. He paced the vast living room like a caged panther, a phone pressed to one ear, a tablet in his hand. "Get me the financials for the Aura Resorts Consortium. I want to know who the majority shareholders are. Find a weakness. No, I don't care if the contracts are ironclad. Find a loophole." "What do you mean there's no buyout clause? That's amateur hour." Ava watched him, a sad recognition dawning on her. He had reverted to his factory settings. He was trying to solve a problem of the heart with the cold logic of a boardroom. For 2 days, he waged his financial war. He made calls, he sent intimidating emails, he had his legal team work around the clock. The result was always the same. "It's no use," he finally said, throwing a thick legal binder onto his glass coffee table with a loud thud. He sank into the sofa, running his hands through his hair in a rare display of defeat. "The deal is airtight. The developers are locked in, and they're not interested in a buyout. They stand to make $1 billion on this resort. My offer is pocket change to them." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a frustration she had never seen before. The great Edward Shaw, the man who could move markets with a single phone call, was powerless. Ava sat down in the armchair across from him. She had been waiting for this moment. She had spent the last 2 days back in her own sanctuary, the Gilded Petal, doing her own kind of research. "You've been trying to outmuscle them, Edward," she said quietly. "You've been fighting fire with fire." "It's the only way I know how to fight," he admitted, his voice rough. "Then it's time you learned a new way," she said. She slid a thin, worn-out book across the table towards him. It was a local history of the Hudson Valley. "We can't fight them on their battlefield. We have to drag them onto ours." He looked at the book, then at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about value," she said, her voice gaining strength, her passion reignited. "They see a piece of land with a dilapidated greenhouse. They see profit margins and property values. We have to make the world see what's really there. A historical treasure, a botanical marvel, a piece of living art." A spark of understanding lit his eyes. "You want to get it declared a landmark." "Exactly," she said. "If we can get the New York State Preservation Board to grant it historical status, it would freeze the demolition permits. It would buy us time." He stood up, a new energy surging through him. "How do we do that?" "It takes months, years sometimes." "We don't have years," she reminded him. "We have until the end of next week. Which means we need to find irrefutable proof of its significance. Something that will force their hand. He looked at her, a slow, admiring smile spreading across his face. He had been trying to throw money at the problem. She was planning to fight with something much more powerful, a story. "All right, Miss Wilson," he said, his voice now a low, excited hum. "What's our first move?" "Our first move," she said, a mischievous glint in her eye, "is to go back to the library. I have a feeling Julian Croft's ghost has a few more secrets to tell us." For the next 4 days, Edward's penthouse was transformed from a minimalist temple of wealth into a chaotic, paper-strewn war room. They had, through another of Edward's substantial donations, managed to get temporary access to the entire Julian Croft archive, which was now piled high on his dining room table. The partnership that had been born in the library basement was now forged in fire. They worked from sunrise to the dead of night, fueled by coffee and a shared, desperate urgency. Edward, to his own surprise, found a strange satisfaction in the meticulous work. He, a man who hadn't read a physical document in years, was now poring over faded architectural blueprints, his fingers tracing the elegant lines of his predecessor. He used his corporate resources not for attack, but for support. He had a team of his best legal researchers scanning property deeds from the 19th century. He had art historians on video calls, analyzing the unique ironwork of the greenhouse. Ava was the general. She was the one who could read between the lines of Croft's elegant script, who could understand the botanical significance of a scribbled note in the margin of a diary. She directed the search, her passion lighting the way. "He used a specific type of Venetian glass," she explained one night, pointing to a shipping receipt from 1903. "It's designed to filter light in a way that mimics a rainforest canopy." This wasn't just a greenhouse, Edward. It was an ecosystem. Edward watched her, completely captivated. She was in her element, a historian, a scientist, a detective, all wrapped up in the body of a florist. Late on the third night, exhaustion had set in. Ava was curled up in a large armchair, a heavy architectural tome open on her lap, her eyes struggling to stay open. Edward, who had been on the phone with a bleary-eyed lawyer in Zurich, hung up and looked at her. He disappeared into the kitchen and returned a few minutes later with a steaming mug and a plate of toast. "Here," he said softly, placing it on the table beside her. "You need to eat." She looked up at him, her eyes soft with gratitude. "You sound like my mother." "My mother," he said, a sad smile touching his lips as he sat on the floor near her chair, "would have loved you." The confession hung in the air, simple and profound. "She would have admired your passion," he continued, his voice a low murmur. "She was the same way with her greenhouse. It was her world. When she was in there, she wasn't Mrs. Shaw, the CEO's wife. She was just a woman who loved making things grow." He looked down at his hands. "I spent my entire life building things, tearing down old structures to make way for new ones. I was the one on the other side of this table, arguing that sentimentality had no place in business." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, painful honesty. I think a part of me has been trying to destroy places like the glass house my whole life, because they reminded me of her, of what I lost." Ava was speechless. It was the most vulnerable she had ever seen him. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, a simple, comforting gesture. "You're not that person anymore, Edward." He looked at her hand on his arm, then into her eyes. "I know," he whispered. "Because of you." He leaned in, and this time, it wasn't a desperate, confused kiss like the one in the archive. It was a kiss of profound connection, of shared vulnerability, of a partnership that had been forged in a battle for something beautiful. It was quiet and tender, and it sealed the unspoken truth that had been growing between them. When they pulled apart, they just looked at each other, the weight of his confession and the tenderness of the kiss filling the silence. "We should get back to work," she said, her voice a little shaky. "Yeah," he agreed, but he didn't move. It was Ava who found it, an hour later, tucked away in Julian Croft's personal correspondence. It was a letter from the original landowner, dated 1899. "It's a covenant," she breathed, her eyes wide with excitement. "A restrictive covenant in the original deed. It states that any structure of significant architectural and botanical merit built on the property must be preserved in perpetuity for the betterment of public knowledge and the celebration of nature's art." Edward grabbed the letter, his own eyes scanning the legal text. "This is it," he said, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. "This is legally binding. It supersedes any sale. Eleanor Croft doesn't have the right to demolish it. The developers don't have the right to demolish it. We can get an injunction." They looked at each other, a shared, giddy wave of relief washing over them. They had done it. They had found the weapon they needed. "I'll have my legal team draft the injunction first thing in the morning," he said, his voice buzzing with victory. "We'll file it by noon. We've won, Ava. We've actually won." They were laughing, the exhaustion of the past few days forgotten in the rush of their triumph. And then Edward's phone rang. It was his private investigator. "Shaw," he answered, his tone still buoyed by their victory. His smile slowly faded as he listened. His face went from triumph to confusion to pure, cold horror. "What is it?" Ava asked, the joy draining from her own face as she saw his expression. He hung up the phone, his hand trembling slightly. "That was my contact upstate," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Eleanor Croft just got a new permit approved, an emergency permit for unstable structure abatement." He looked at her, his eyes dark with a new, terrifying urgency. "She's not waiting until the end of next week, Ava. The demolition crew arrives tomorrow. At dawn." For a single, frozen moment, the world stopped. The triumphant energy in the penthouse evaporated, replaced by a silence so profound it was deafening. Demolition. At dawn. Ava felt the floor drop out from under her. All their work, the dusty journals, the shared discoveries, the fragile hope they had built, it was all about to be reduced to a pile of rubble. But then she looked at Edward. The shock on his face was quickly replaced by something else, something she had never seen in him before. A cold, calm, and utterly absolute fury. The predator was back, but this time he wasn't hunting for profit. He was hunting for justice. "No," he said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. "She doesn't get to win." He grabbed his phone, his movements now precise and economical. The panic was gone, replaced by the lethal efficiency of a general launching a counterattack. "Get the chopper on the roof. Now," he barked into the phone. "And get Judge Miller on the line. I don't care if you have to wake him from the dead, you get him on the phone. Tell him it's about the Vance Covenant of 1899. He hung up and was already dialing another number. "David, it's Shaw. I need an emergency injunction drafted and filed within the hour. The property at 14 Whisper Lane, yes, the Croft Estate, grounds, violation of a historical preservation covenant. I'm emailing you the documentation now." He turned to Ava, his eyes burning with an intensity that took her breath away. "Go," he said. "Get whatever you need. We leave in 10 minutes. She didn't question him. She didn't hesitate. She saw in his eyes the same fierce, protective passion she felt in her own heart. They were a team. The helicopter ride upstate was a blur of darkness and the thrumming of rotor blades. Below them, the city lights gave way to a vast, sleeping countryside. Ava sat beside Edward, the leather-bound book from Silas Blackwood clutched in her lap. Her mind was racing, trying to piece together the final clues from Finch's journals. "My queen rests where whispers live in glass. It has to be a specific place inside the greenhouse," she said, her voice raised over the noise of the engine. "A place he designed just for her." Edward was on a satellite phone with his legal team, a grim expression on his face. "The judge is reviewing the covenant. He's skeptical about issuing an injunction at this hour without a formal hearing. Tell him to look at the precedent. Vance v. the City of New York, 1923. My great-grandfather set the legal standard for these kinds of covenants." He listened for a moment, his jaw tight. "He'll give us a temporary stay. But it's only good until 9 a.m. We have to serve the papers to Eleanor Croft and the demolition foreman by then." He hung up and looked at Ava. "We have a few hours at best." The helicopter landed in a clearing a half-mile from the estate, just as the first hint of gray light began to streak the eastern sky. They ran the rest of the way, the damp, cold air burning their lungs. When they reached the edge of the property, the scene made Ava's heart stop. The magnificent, ghostly structure of the Glass House of Whispers was now illuminated by the harsh, artificial glare of massive floodlights. 2 yellow bulldozers stood at the entrance like giant, sleeping beasts, their metal claws glinting in the light. A handful of workers in hard hats were milling around, sipping coffee, waiting for the order to begin. "We don't have much time," Edward said, his voice a low whisper. He pointed to a small, dark figure standing near the entrance, talking to a man in a foreman's vest. "That's Eleanor. We need to get inside before they see us," Ava said, her eyes scanning the perimeter of the greenhouse. She spotted a small, broken pane of glass near the back, half hidden by a thicket of overgrown roses. "There." They scrambled through the wet undergrowth, Edward's expensive jeans getting snagged on thorns. He didn't seem to notice. They reached the broken pane and, one by one, carefully slipped inside. The interior of the greenhouse was even more magical and haunting in the pre-dawn gloom. The air was still and cool, and the strange, exotic plants looked like sleeping creatures from another world. "Where do we even start?" Edward whispered, his voice echoing in the vast, silent space. Ava closed her eyes, trying to think like Alistair Finch, a man of science but also romantic, a poet. "Where whispers live in glass." "Whispers," she murmured, her eyes scanning the intricate ironwork of the structure. "It's about acoustics, sound." She looked up at the massive domed ceiling, the central rotunda. The shape is designed to carry sound, to make it whisper. She led him through the overgrown paths towards the center of the greenhouse. The rotunda was a breathtaking space, a perfect circle of glass rising 100 feet above them. In the center was a small ornamental pond, now choked with water lilies. "This is where he would have put her," Ava said, her voice filled with a quiet certainty. "At the very heart of his sanctuary." They began their frantic search, their phone flashlights cutting beams through the darkness. They checked every plant, every pot, every hidden corner of the rotunda. They found dozens of rare orchids, but not the one. As they searched, the sky outside began to lighten, from gray to a soft, pearly pink. The sound of a truck engine starting up outside made them both freeze. "They're starting," Edward said, his voice grim. "We're missing something," Ava said, her frustration mounting. She looked around the rotunda, her eyes darting from the pond to the intricate lattice of ironwork above. Finch was a romantic, but he was also a scientist. It has to be logical. She thought of the journals, of his obsession with mimicking natural ecosystems. "A microclimate," she whispered, the idea hitting her with the force of a physical blow. He would have created a special microclimate for her. She scanned the perimeter of the rotunda, looking for anything out of place. And then she saw it. Behind a curtain of thick, hanging moss, there was a small, almost invisible door set into the base of a massive stone planter. It was an access panel for the greenhouse's original irrigation system. "Edward, help me," she said, pulling at the moss. Together, they tore away the thick vegetation, revealing the small, rusted iron door. It was locked. "Stand back," Edward said. He took a heavy, discarded iron pot and, with a powerful swing, smashed it against the lock. The rusted metal groaned and then snapped. He pulled the door open, revealing a dark, narrow passage. A wave of cool, humid air washed over them, carrying a faint, earthy, and strangely familiar scent. Ava's heart hammered in her chest. She knew that scent. They crawled into the narrow space. It was a maintenance tunnel, dark and damp, but at the end of it there was a faint, purple glow. They followed the light and emerged into a small, hidden grotto, a secret chamber built beneath the rotunda. And there it was. It was growing from a bed of black, volcanic rock, a single, magnificent specimen of Taka chantrieri. Its petals, like the wings of a bat, were a deep, velvety black, and its long, whisker-like bracteoles hung down, almost touching the ground. It was illuminated by a single, low-wattage grow light, the source of the purple glow. It was more beautiful and more mysterious than any picture could capture. "My God," Ava breathed, tears of awe and relief streaming down her face. They had found it. They had found the queen. They stood there for a long moment, mesmerized by the impossible beauty of the flower. And then they heard a deafening roar. The ground beneath them shuddered. "It's the bulldozers," Edward said, his voice grim. They carefully, reverently, lifted the pot containing the orchid. As they emerged from the hidden grotto, the first rays of the morning sun streamed through the glass, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. They ran back towards the entrance of the greenhouse, the precious flower held between them. As they burst out into the morning light, they were met with a scene of imminent destruction. The first bulldozer was just feet from the glass wall, its massive engine rumbling, its metal claw raised, ready to strike. Eleanor Croft stood beside it, a cold, triumphant smile on her face. "Too late," she called out, her voice cutting through the engine noise. "No," Edward shouted back, stepping in front of the bulldozer. "You're too late." Just then, a black sedan screeched to a halt on the gravel path. One of Edward's lawyers jumped out, waving a piece of paper. "Eleanor Croft," the lawyer yelled. "You've been served. This is a temporary injunction, effective immediately. All demolition work is to cease and desist pending a hearing on the historical preservation of this property." Eleanor's smile vanished. She snatched the paper from the lawyer, her eyes scanning the legal text, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. The foreman of the demolition crew, a large man in a dusty hard hat, looked from Eleanor to Edward, completely confused. "So, what do I do?" Edward looked at the man, then at Eleanor, then at the magnificent greenhouse behind him. He thought of his mother, of Alistair Finch, of the stubborn, brilliant woman standing beside him, holding a flower that was supposed to be impossible. He smiled, a slow, tired, and completely triumphant smile. "You," he said to the foreman, "turn off your engine and go home." The drive back to the city was a quiet, exhausted blur. The precious black bat orchid sat securely in a climate-controlled case in the back seat, a silent queen returning to her kingdom. Ava kept glancing at it, then at Edward, a slow, wondrous smile playing on her lips. They had done the impossible. Edward drove, the tension of the last few days finally draining from his shoulders, leaving a profound weariness in its place. He looked at Ava, at the smudge of dirt on her cheek and the triumphant light in her eyes, and he knew he had never seen anything more beautiful. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice a soft murmur that barely broke the silence. He reached over and took her hand, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. "Now," he said, his voice a low, tired rumble, "we go to war." She looked at him, confused. "War? I thought we just won." "We won the battle, Ava," he said, a grim smile touching his lips as he navigated the awakening city streets. "The war is just beginning." He was right. The news of his actions had traveled faster than their helicopter. He had defied a major development group, used company resources for a personal errand, and most damningly, had secured a court injunction that put Shaw Industries in direct conflict with some of the most powerful real estate players in the state. His board of directors was not pleased. The emergency meeting was called for the next day. The atmosphere in the 80th floor boardroom was glacial. The dozen men and women who comprised his board, people he had known his entire life, looked at him not as their leader, but as a problem to be managed. "Edward, explain yourself," said Thomas Blackwood, the board's chairman and an old friend of his father's. His voice was laced with a disappointed, paternal authority. "You cancel the Berlin merger at the last minute. You disappear for days on a botanical scavenger hunt. And now you've single-handedly sabotaged a billion-dollar resort project that several of our key investors had a stake in. Have you lost your mind?" Edward stood at the head of the table, calm and unshaken. He was not the same man who had last stood in this room. "On the contrary, Thomas," he said, his voice steady, "I think I've finally found it." "This is not a joke, Edward," another board member, a sharp-faced woman named Catherine, interjected. "Your erratic behavior has put this company at risk. The shareholders are panicking. We are demanding that you drop this injunction and publicly distance yourself from this entire affair." "And from Miss Wilson, I presume?" Edward added, his gaze sweeping the room. "The florist?" Thomas scoffed. "Yes. She is a distraction you can no longer afford." It was the moment of his judgment, the final test. His old world, the world of cold logic and colder profits, was giving him an ultimatum: choose us or choose her. Edward smiled, a slow, confident smile that unsettled them all. "Gentlemen, ladies," he began, his voice ringing with a new kind of authority, "you are absolutely right. My behavior has been erratic. I have neglected my duties, and I have allowed a personal matter to influence my business decisions." A wave of relief washed over the room. They thought he was capitulating. "And it is the best damn thing that has ever happened to this company," he continued, his voice rising with a passion they had never heard before. "For years, we have measured success in stock points and profit margins. We have built an empire of glass and steel, but we have built it on hollow ground." He looked around the table at the confused and angry faces. This affair, as you call it, was a search for a single flower, a flower that was my mother's legacy, a flower that this company, in its relentless pursuit of growth, would have gladly bulldozed without a second thought. He walked over to the large window, looking down at the city he had conquered. A woman I met by accident, a woman you dismiss as a florist, taught me a lesson that my Harvard MBA never did. She taught me that some things have a value that cannot be quantified, that legacy is more important than profit, that the soul of a company is not in its balance sheet but in its character. He turned back to face them, his eyes blazing. So, no, Thomas, I will not drop the injunction. In fact, I am going to do something more. He pressed a button on the conference phone. David, are you there? His CFO's voice came through, crisp and clear. Yes, sir. Proceed with the transfer, Edward commanded. Transfer? What transfer? Catherine demanded. I am using 30% of my personal shares in Shaw Industries, Edward announced, to create a private trust. That trust is, as we speak, purchasing the Croft estate from the developers at a premium they cannot refuse. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. He was liquidating a massive portion of his own fortune. And what do you plan to do with this bankrupting act of sentimentality? Thomas asked, his voice dripping with scorn. Edward smiled. I'm glad you asked. He looked toward the door, which opened softly. Ava walked in, dressed in a simple, elegant dress, her head held high. She stood beside him, a silent, powerful partner. We are turning the glass house of whispers into a foundation, Edward declared, his hand resting on the small of Ava's back. It will be a botanical research and preservation center, open to the public. It will be a place where beauty and history are protected, not demolished for a profit. He looked at Ava, his voice filled with a love and respect that was undeniable. And it will be run by its new executive director, Miss Ava Wilson. He turned back to the stunned board. The foundation will be named the Lillian Shaw Botanical Trust. In honor of my mother, her legacy will no longer be a crushed flower in a briefcase. It will be a living, breathing sanctuary for generations to come. He took a deep breath, the finality of his decision settling over him like a warm cloak. As for my position as CEO, you can have it. My resignation is on your desk. I have found a new project to invest in, a project of the heart. He took Ava's hand and, without looking back, they walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind a group of the most powerful people in New York who were, for the first time, completely and utterly speechless. That evening, they stood together inside the glass house of whispers. The setting sun streamed through the ancient glass, casting long, golden shafts of light through the leaves. The air was warm and smelled of earth and life. The single perfect black bat orchid sat in a place of honor in the central rotunda, its dark petals a testament to their impossible journey. The Lillian Shaw Botanical Trust, Ava said, testing the words on her tongue. It has a beautiful ring to it. It was her dream, Edward said quietly, coming to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. A place where things could just grow, without pressure, without expectation. He rested his chin on her shoulder. You brought her dream back to life, Ava. We did, she corrected, leaning back against him. They stood in a comfortable silence for a long time, just watching the light fade. Ava, he said finally, his voice a low murmur against her ear. She turned in his arms to face him. That night on the street, he began, his eyes searching hers. You saved my life. I was so lost in my own anger, my own grief. I was completely blind. You didn't just push me out of the way of a taxi, Ava. You pushed me out of the way of myself. Tears welled in her eyes. You taught me how to see again, he whispered, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. And all I want to see for the rest of my life is you. He slowly got down on one knee, right there on the cracked marble floor of their sanctuary. He didn't have a ring box. He didn't have a prepared speech. He just had the simple, unadorned truth in his heart. Ava Wilson, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You are the rarest, most beautiful, and most honest thing in my life. Will you marry me? Will you build this legacy with me? She was crying and laughing at the same time, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that echoed through the glass cathedral. Yes, she whispered, pulling him to his feet. Yes, 1,000 times yes. He kissed her, and in that kiss was the promise of 1,000 shared sunrises, of a home filled with life, of a love that was found in the wreckage and had blossomed into something more beautiful than the rarest flower. 1 year later. The glass house of whispers was no longer silent. It was filled with the soft murmur of visitors and the excited chatter of students. Under Ava's direction, the Lillian Shaw Botanical Trust had become a world-renowned center for conservation and education. Edward, no longer a CEO, had found a new purpose. He worked alongside Ava, handling the business side of the foundation, his old skills now used not to build an empire, but to nurture a dream. That afternoon, they stood together in the central rotunda, watching a group of children sketch the flowers. In its place of honor, the blackbat orchid was in full, glorious bloom. "She's beautiful," Ava said, leaning her head on Edward's shoulder. "Not as beautiful as you," he replied, kissing the top of her head. A small hand tugged on Ava's dress. She looked down to see a little girl with bright, curious eyes, holding up a crayon drawing. It was a charmingly wobbly picture of the blackbat orchid. "It's for the flowers, Mommy," the little girl said. Ava smiled, her eyes meeting Edward's over the child's head. She placed a hand on her own gently swelling belly. "Thank you, sweetheart," Ava said, her voice filled with a quiet, profound happiness. "I'll make sure she gets it." And as the sun set on their sanctuary, they knew their greatest adventure was just beginning to grow. What did you think of the story of Edward and Ava? On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate their journey from a mistaken accusation to a life-saving love? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And for everyone who has stayed with us until the very end, who believes that true value is found in the heart, please comment "True Legacy." We are so grateful to share these stories with you. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more narratives that will change the world.